Okay, so this is going to be a tutorial in which I'm going to talk about lighting. Now I've already talked about this in one of the previous tutorials to an extent, but what I really want to do is talk more in depth about lighting and how lighting contributes to a really effective presentation inside of Voyager. And I'll be examining a group of different ideas with lighting, because we can approach lighting in a few different ways inside of Voyager. So to start off with, I've just got this kind of basic figure in here, and we're going to generally talk about the most common and the most obvious of the lighting options inside of Voyager, and that is using the inbuilt sun. So I'm going to jump right into it. This file that I'm starting with is using the little man figure that you can find inside the Voyager bundle when you first get it, of some of the example files. I've just imported it into Voyager as a DF object, which we kind of know about now. So it's a DF object. I put in a little flat plane, and you'll see there's a couple of other things in there which I'll talk about in a little while. So he's just standing on a flat featureless plane at this point. I'm lighting him here with the main sun, and as you know, we can move the sun around and we can get different directions on the sun to have the light coming from wherever we like. And if we enable cast shadows, we'll also be able to get shadows cast from our objects onto the landscape or onto other objects. So that's pretty straightforward, and everybody has kind of played with that concept. One thing that I'm just going to jump into and explain right off the top is just a more accurate way of moving the sun. So most people grab this and you can tool it around like that, and that's kind of one way of moving your sun around. There's a better way of doing it once you get a little bit more into getting accurate kind of lighting inside of Voyager. And that is to use, if you click on this icon here, which brings up the environment settings, you have the ability to move the sun here by putting numerical entry into it. You can also just drag up and down, and that will move the sun as well. So you've got 3 axes of control of where the sun is. But it's probably, one of the things it's probably useful for is getting kind of finer control than you can get with the little sun orb here. And the way that you would do that is by using these numeric data entry fields, which you can just type straight into, of course, and you can put in a figure and the sun will move to that location. But also you can get fine control by dragging and holding down Option. So you can actually get kind of very kind of fine controls. That's mostly useful when you have the sun sitting right behind you. Let's just see if we can do that. I'll just put it down on the horizon. I don't have a sun selected in the sky here, so let's do that. And I'll just see if I can get the sun into shot, as it were. I've got to have my atmosphere up a bit to do that, I think. Oops, there we go. You can see why this is such a kind of a fiddly thing to do. Once we have it in shot like that, and just say we wanted to tweak it, there is a way of doing that by using the environmental settings here, and you can just Option click on it, and you'll get much finer movements of the sun by doing this. So you can actually get it, just where you want it to be. You can almost see how it's just moving slightly there. These are just very small increments, which is often very useful if you've got your camera on a long lens and you're trying to get, sort of like an area in your shot. I just thought I'd point that out because a lot of the time, you find you might kind of tweaking around with this and you're really not getting much joy getting something to happen here. So it's just a better way of doing that. Okay, so it's all fine to use the inbuilt sun, but one thing that I do notice when I see a lot of the stuff being posted on our Worlds of ArtMatic group is that the problem with the sun is that it tends to give you very flat lighting. And in the photographic world, if you're actually going out and shooting landscapes, it's kind of almost a truism that people very rarely actually shoot a landscape with the sun at zenith. In fact, photographers often don't walk out at midday to try and do things because they know that the sun is actually going to be very flat and not give a particularly attractive look to their shot. So one of the first things that is kind of helpful to know is to drop your sun down onto the horizon or keep it lowish. You'll get much more dramatic lighting by doing that. It's particularly obvious in landscapes. In fact, let's just have a look at a landscape because I've got a landscape here. Let's just open the landscape lighting. I'll come back to our figure in a minute, just while we're talking about the sun. But here's a shot that you can see. This is where the sun is right up on top, and it's pretty kind of ordinary. It gives you that very flat kind of look to it. You can get much more dramatic shots by dropping down the sun, as I have done in this next little pane here. So here I put the sun behind the landscape terrain in the foreground here. And already you can kind of see that's a more dramatic kind of look happening. I've added a little bit of haze there as well, and I've added a little bit more atmosphere and a bit of ambient. And here we're using the automatic with scattering module for the way the atmosphere behaves. So drama straight away in doing something like that. I'll just skip over to this shot where the sun again is down quite low, and I'm just going to show you what happens when we enable cast shadows here. We'll straight away get some differences. We can see the shadows are being cast by the landscape. In fact, let's just go to this next one. And you can see that the landscape is casting shadows on itself. And if we turn that off, you'll get an idea of how much different that looks. It looks a lot flatter. And there is a sort of a kind of a shadowing going on, because you can see there is a sort of an ambient shadowing going on in the landscape. But having direct cast shadows on does give you a much more realistic looking landscape. And it's also worth noting here that when you have cast shadows switched on, the clouds themselves will also cast shadows on your landscape. And sometimes that can give you very really attractive looks. If you've got clouds in your sky and you've got clouds cast on the landscape, you know, get the realistic kind of look of having you know, that kind of shadowing that you would normally get on a landscape from clouds. So keep that in mind. It does take a little bit longer to render things when cast shadows is on, particularly if you're using volumetric clouds. But it's worth that tiny little bit of extra time to get that kind of increase in drama. So that's one thing to think about. So, you know, keep in mind that, you know, getting your sun down low, where it has a little bit more drama and it shows up a little bit more detail, is one thing you'll want to do to improve your landscapes and get them to look a little nicer. You might also consider changing the sun color. I mean, you know, people dive right into the funky colors pretty quickly and try and do all this kind of stuff. But keep in mind that realistically, the sun tends to kind of hover around these sorts of colors here, kind of orangey colors, you know, all the way through from very sunsetty dark reds, all the way through to kind of light, kind of pale orange colors. And even you can even use sort of bluish colors. You'll still maintain some level of realism with that. You'd probably do that if you were looking for a landscape that was kind of more overcast, which is also possible to do in Voyager. While we're talking about this situation with the sun, I'm going to also tell you another thing about how the lighting works. We have to kind of jump backwards and forwards a little bit here because there's so many little aspects to this. But you'll have noticed probably that in this shot I have another sun. And Voyager allows us now to have 4 independent suns if we want. And that is done by bringing up the palette with the lights. And we do that by hitting Command L. That's one way of bringing it up. So move my little window down there. And another way of bringing it up is to go up here, and you can click on this icon and that will also bring up your lights. And you'll see here that I actually have 4 lights available to me, and this one is called Star. I can change all of them into the Star mode, and I do that by just selecting additional Star here. And once I do that, the light that I select now behaves like a sun, like another sun. So you can actually use that as a second sun source, and like the sun, the main sun, you can color it as well. You can also switch it off, just making it inactive. It'll disappear from the sky there. One useful reason that you might want to use these kind of other suns, aside from having, you know, alien planets with two suns, is that you can do this kind of thing. So if we just switch off the internal sun, we do that just by making it black. If we make the sun black, it will no longer cast any light. And we go into our lighting panel again. One thing that we can do is we can make this additional sun larger quite easily just by increasing its size here. And this is a really good thing to be able to do if you want to get that kind of those big sunset kind of effects, which you can actually do with the inbuilt sun, of course. But to do it with the inbuilt sun is somewhat more complicated because it's a fixed size, and so if you want to make it look bigger in your shot, you have to actually zoom into the shot so that the sun in itself will look bigger. So, you know, that's not always ideal because you might have your landscape set up in a particular way, and trying to get that balance between you know, a good landscape and that really zoomed in effect is sometimes very tricky. That's what you do photographically, but if you have control over the size of the sun like you do here, it's just an easier way of doing something like that. One thing I should actually point out too is, while we're in this mode, let's just try something else here. Actually, I'll go back. Sorry, I'll just make that sun back down to smallish size again. Okay, and I'll switch on I'll give some color to our main sun. One thing that's useful to be able to do with a second sun is not to have it necessarily in shot like this, but to put it in such a place that it's actually lighting the landscape from somewhere else. So you don't actually see it, but what it's basically doing, it's giving you some fill light. And photographers often talk about using fill light, where you want to get some detail in something, but you don't want it to be the main source of the light. So if we drop the intensity down of this particular thing a little bit, what we've done here is we've added a little bit of fill light into the landscape, even though the sun is our main light source still. So let's just switch it off so we can see what contribution it's having. So you can see that the sun, the main sun, is still providing, you know, the lighting for the clouds and the rim lighting for the terrain and so forth. But when we add our fill light in, it's just filling in some of the landscape a little bit. Put cast shadows on, we'll get shadows from both. You have to watch this a bit because you obviously don't want dual shadows. That would be kind of wrong. And let's just drop this down a little bit more. And we'll swing it out here a little bit as well. I've dropped it down too much now. No, you can kind of see what it's doing now. So we have our main sun doing most of the heavy lifting here, but you can see that the extra sun is now just giving us a little bit more detail in our landscape. I'll switch it off so you can see that a little bit more clearly. It's all a bit kind of uniform there, but if we switch this one on, we're just getting that little bit of a kick in there of a little bit of extra light, which of course we can control the color of as well. So with some judicious kind of color balancing, you can get some really lovely effects in your landscape that look fairly natural and fairly realistic, but just give you that kind of, they elevate you up from those kind of very one-dimensional effects that you get with one sun. So let's just pop out of there now, and I'll just put that in there and save it as a preset because it's useful, and save my file. I'm just going to pop out of there and we'll go back into, actually we need to go back and find our guy. And so we've seen a little bit about getting a second light source in there using the suns. And I've also showed you how to switch the sun off. So let's just look into this panel here. And this is now a useful starting point if you want to have an image where you don't have any light at all. And I'll show you how to do that. First of all, the first thing you want to do is switch your sun to black. So at this point, there is actually, the figure is still in this landscape. But what I have actually done is I've done a bunch of other things. I've switched all of these tools down, all of these sliders down. So there is no ambient light, there is no wetness or haze or atmosphere. Those kinds of things have an effect on what you see in your shot. He said, but nothing actually did. That's because I have got no sky color. That's another thing that I've taken off there, taken the sky color right down as well. So just to recap, because I have to remember all the things I do to do this. So I've taken down the sky color to black. I've made the cloud colors black. There's no clouds in this because I have a clear sky selected. And the other fundamental thing that I have done, if we look in the DF objects, is I've also taken the ambient level of my character right down, although it's not switched completely off here. One thing I'll just show you is we'll just go in and I'll make that sky a little lighter again. I'm just going to show you another aspect of, so we've got a lighter sky. You see our figure is still very dark here because there is no real ambient light falling on anything. If I bring up some ambient light, you'll see I get a little bit of sort of effect on the figure. And if I'm in the DF object panel and I bring up the ambient level here, you'll see I'm actually controlling the ambient level on the character itself, on the figure itself. Now, ambient light, as I said before, is light that's bouncing around from everywhere else, and it has no real directional characteristic. In this case, it is coming from above, and that's because the sky is, above the character and is fully 360 degrees. I'm just going to switch the sky back to black again because I'm going to show you the next little step. Oh, there's one other thing I should talk about while I'm in this kind of mode, and that is one of the aspects of lighting, which is called occlusion, ambient occlusion. You can see here on this particular figure, I've got a little bit of shadow underneath the character, which is not to do with having the cast shadows on. It's just like an ambient shadow. It's kind of the equivalent of ambient light, but it's actually ambient shadow. And that's controlled by this little slider here. If I turn this right off, you'll see that the ambient occlusion almost vanishes. I have to turn it off on the man as well because it's shadowing everywhere. And he now has no ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is that kind of shadowing that you get when you have kind of no direct light, but you know that if you're standing outside and you're under a tree or something, you've got a little bit of shadow underneath you that's a bit denser than the shadow of the tree. That's kind of what ambient occlusion is, ambient shadowing is. It serves a really interesting purpose in many cases where you've got objects and they don't feel like they're stuck to the ground. They feel like they're kind of floating, and without having an actual fully cast shadow on, it just sort of feels a little bit odd. It's always a good idea to have a little bit of it. Sometimes it looks very strange if you've got too much of it though, so be aware that it can actually look very weird. It also can take a little bit more rendering time, so it's one thing to keep in mind. I'm just going to close this window. Because I'll just jump back into this mode again where I have everything switched off. So just to recap, got the sun switched to black. I've switched off all of these ambient atmospheric controls have all been switched down as well. I've switched my sky. I've got a clear sky selected and I've switched that to black. I've put clouds to black, although there are no clouds in this particular thing. And so I get a completely black frame. And the reason that I want to do that is because now I can now have control over all the lighting. And let me just show you that. I've actually prepared a frame here, but I'm just going to show you in pieces how this would work. So my figure is still standing there. It's just not lit by anything at this stage. So I'm going to bring up the lighting panel again. I have a light here and it's active. but I think it's away from where we are in the origin. So if I hit the home control, that will put us right at the origin where the figure is currently sitting. And if I click this control, that will put our light right at the origin. That's what that does. And this will make sure that we can actually see our camera. So let's just zoom right out here. What's happened here is the light is actually right in the middle. It's sitting at the origin, which is where the figure is as well. So let me just move it off to the side a little bit. Where I'm clicking here is moving the light, and the light's actually sitting quite a long way below the figure at this point. So let's just bring it up to about 80. It's above the figure, so it's a bit high. 70. If I make the light visible, we can also see where it is. So let's just zoom out a bit. So now I've actually just brought in another light source, and it's just acting as a point light source, which I can move around as I like. I will confess I do not like these zooming controls. They are cumbersome. So there's a second light source. Let me just bail out of there. I'm just going to jump across to the prepared one that I have here, where I have two light sources. Let's go in and look at our light sources, and we'll just zoom out. You can see now I have two light sources. One's placed in front of this character and one's placed behind the character. And one of the things I want you to note, straight away is that these light sources now give our character a little bit of contouring and a little bit of effect. This would be the kind of thing that we would do when we were actually employing lighting in a photographic sense. We take our lights and we give our characters contours by placing the lights where we want them to be. Here I've picked out some of the character from the back here. I picked out some of the edges of the character so that they don't go all kind of monochrome and black. Let me just switch off these lights. I'm just going to switch off the show light function. The light's still there, but it's not being shown. So let me just switch both of those off. And you can see, I'll switch off we'll go back to the blue light and I'll just switch it off. You can see this character kind of goes black in the shadows behind, and it fades kind of, into the background. If I put in a kick light at the back there, what we call a kick light or a rim light, what it's doing is it's just adding a little bit of extra contour to the figure, and that often helps to pick figures out from the background. So that's something to think about with lighting sources as well. And you can obviously do this with up to 4 lights. So you can actually use 4 lights to light your figure. You don't have to see those lights. I find it's often useful when you're setting things up to show them. But they don't, it's not necessary to have them there to actually have them doing the lighting. And you would hope you wouldn't want them there unless you intentionally wanted to see them. One thing that is actually useful though, I'll point this out now, is let's just put our light behind the figure. So I can't actually see it. It's actually casting some light on the ground there. One of the really nice things about the show light function is you can't see it at the moment, but if I make it bigger, we can get a kind of a nice haze behind a character. And that's also quite nice for being able to lift things out from a background. So you might like to think about that. That basically just changes the light size, the visibility size, almost like we saw with the sun when we had it selected as an additional star in that last little sequence. If you make them very small, of course, then they will kind of be almost hard to see. I only use them, I put them quite small when I'm trying to place something in a scene. It just helps me find where the light is. It's basically the only reason I use it. Just allows me to see it, basically. And once I've got my lighting set up, I probably just switch the show light off. Okay, so using lights in that way is a very powerful thing, and I wanted to kind of just talk about a few things you can do with those lights. Here I've used them to model a character or an object. That's obviously one way you would do it. But there's a thing to keep in mind when you're working with Voyager, that you can actually also use those lights to give extra light into landscapes. You can put those lights inside of clouds, for instance. So you can actually get a light way up in the sky, like 1,000 feet up in the sky, inside a cloud as an additional light source inside a cloud. And that can give you really lovely effects. You can also use those lights to place in a location. So if you have a very dark location, you can put a light source in a location and kick light off little parts of that location. You just place them in exactly the same way as I did there, but you put them in a landscape. And of course, you have the ability to have the light fall off increase quite a lot by bringing them up here. Like that's 20,000 meters of lighting. So inside a landscape, you can light a fairly large area. So keep that in mind. Those additional light sources, which come up under the lights menu, are really useful for putting kick lights into your landscapes. And I do that all the time, maybe just to put some kick on a cloud, maybe to put a little bit of light on a feature in the landscape that I really like, and then I just want it to kind of kick up a bit. Trying to keep it as natural as I can, unless I want it to be kind of artificial, but trying to get that sort of modeling that goes on in the landscapes. Just remembering again that one sun beam, one sun flat light is nearly always pretty ordinary. So think about all those extra light sources as being part of your lighting palette. Oh, and I should talk about one further form of lighting too that you have available inside the lighting palette before I get onto this next thing, and that is a directional beam. So you can actually switch your light to a beam that's kind of like a spotlight. Let's go in and just switch off the orange light. So I've only got the blue light on now, but I've now selected it to directional beam. And you've noticed that I've now have this kind of little tool for moving the light. And this kind of now functions a little bit like a spotlight. So I can swing it around, and depending, where it's pointing, it can be casting light in a direction onto a character. And you can see how I just got that to a point there where now it's looking a little bit like a spotlight is actually shining on the character. It's not shining its light everywhere, so I'm not getting any light on the ground. I'm just getting a kind of a spotlight on that particular character. Let's go into our orange light and we'll put that on again. In this case, as you saw before, when I had it as a point light, when I had the blue light as a point light, it was casting light on the ground. You might not want that to happen. So if you make it a directional beam, it's still casting its light, it's pointing its light onto the figure, but it's now controllable as to where it shines, like a spotlight. So keep that in mind. That's another way of using the inbuilt lights. And also as an additional star, because now it's actually acting like a sun. So it's a much more global light. It's not as focused as the spotlight. The next thing that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to jump into a whole other way of doing lighting. So far we've seen the sun, and we've seen the additional lights coming from the lighting palette here. But there's one further way of managing light in Voyager, and that is using lights that are actually depth field objects. And so I'm going to go into another prepared file, and now we have two lights that look almost the same as what I just had with the directional lights. But if we go into our lighting palette, you'll see that I can switch off any lights that might happen to be in here. Didn't think they were actually active anyway, but let's just switch them all off. So we don't have any active lights at all. You see that that doesn't change anything. Those lights are a long way from where they were. And we still have light sources. That is to say our light palette is not producing any light. Our sun is not producing any light. These lights, this light is being produced by depth field objects, which are light sources. So this has a bunch of different possibilities that you don't have with the inbuilt lights. The first one is you can have many more of them. So you don't actually have to have a single light or four, up to a maximum of 4 lights. You can literally have a dozen lights, or you can have several dozen lights, or even hundreds of lights. Like any depth field object, you can apply jitter to them, which basically means that it duplicates the objects and sets them off from one another, and they become independent light sources. You can mirror them. You can do all kinds of things. Anything you can do with a depth field object, you can do with a light. And even more importantly, one fundamental thing that you can do with these lights that you can't do with the inbuilt lights is you can animate them. So that means you can actually have an animation running, which will move the lights. So let's have a look at that here. This is just a simple animation where I just move the lights from one point to another, but anything that I can animate with a DF object, I can actually animate with the lights, and you'll see all the shadowing works as well. Let's have a look at how that's done. So let's go into the DF object panel, and you'll see I have two new objects that were actually blanked out before. We've got our sphere and our flat plane here. We've got a light sphere and another light sphere. They're basically the same object, just duplicated. Let's just have a look at that. So I'm going to just switch to the editing mode in ArtMatic Designer. Probably have to select it in this mode. And that's the system that actually oh, by the way, I'll just explain why that happened then, because I'm recording this on Zoom, so it doesn't this doesn't flip to ArtMatic as it would under normal circumstances. That would normally just be a flipping to ArtMatic. So I have to actually do a menu thing to get to ArtMatic, just to explain what happened there, so you weren't confused. Okay, so this is the system that controls what you're seeing there. Basically, there are two things going on in the system. One is that this part of the system, you should, if you followed my previous tutorials, you should recognize this, because this is an object. And if we click on this, we'll see that it's a sphere. So it's a very simple object, and it's got some color associated with it. It's going into a 4in, 4out tile, which is just basically a mixer tile. And there's a duplication of that down here just for reasons that make it easier to deal with in Voyager, which I'll show you in a minute. So that's what that half does. It would just be a depth field object under normal circumstances. And if we went back into Voyager and had a look at that, we would see it as a depth field object if it was selected as volumetric opaque. There it is. It's just an object, exactly as you would expect it to be. But as you saw, I have it selected to volumetric lights. And that's why it looks like a light. It's now been, I've told Voyager to think of this object as a light. And of course, you can do that with any object. Any object can be a light. There's one other part to this system, which is kind of an interesting part of it. And that is this little part here. I'm just going to deactivate this for a minute. And that's the reason we have two tiles here. By moving it up, I can't do that. All right, let me just move this one down. Can't do that either. I'm going to delete it then. And the reason that I've done that is I have to go back into here, and I'll show you. You immediately see that it's changed the way that it's working. And that's because what that other part of the system was doing is actually creating an ability to control the directionality of the lights inside of Voyager. And you can immediately see that it doesn't look correct. And that's because even though I have it selected as volumetric lights, I've got to go into the ArtMatic extra outputs and select it to light direction. And so what's happening here is that in this ArtMatic system, this whole side of the ArtMatic system is actually controlling an aspect of the light that allows it to have directionality. The way I've got it set up in here is that it's basically controlled by where the light is. So if I move the light around, that's what's going to control the directionality of the light. But I can actually control other aspects of it using vector controls to do all kinds of things with the light. I can even simulate that thing that we saw before with the spotlight kind of effect that we had on lights, that the actual direction of the light can be changed independently of where the light actually is. And of course, that's what allows us to animate this particular system, because the light now is actually being controlled from the point of wherever the DF object is. And I can have as many of those DF objects as I like. I can do all kinds of things with those objects. I can even, as I said, I can mirror them and duplicate them and do all kinds of things. So that's obviously a very powerful way to use lights, light sources inside of Voyager using the DF object principle. I'll make these files available so that you can actually play with these files, and you can kind of see how this works for yourself. But I'm hoping that you know, what we've gone through there has given you a few new ideas of how you might like to approach lighting inside of Voyager. What I'm going to do is, once I'll get this tutorial uploaded, and then when you've had a play with these things, maybe we can do a kind of a Q&A on the Worlds of ArtMatic list, where you can ask me some questions, and I can kind of address those questions maybe in another tutorial, or even just in the conversation that we have. I really wanted to make this kind of an online thing, but it's just too hard to manage all the time zones with all the different people. So there you have it, a little kind of bit of a masterclass in the way that you can actually, you know, use lights and lighting inside of ArtMatic Voyager.